Welcome to Thrivers, impact-driven leadership for the next normal. I am your host, Tucker Wanamaker, the CEO of Thrive Impact. And if you're listening to this, you're probably someone who doesn't just want to do nice things in the world, but you actually want to create positive change in people's lives and not burn out while doing it. Well, how do you do that? Well, that's our mission, is really to redefine what normal is for workplace leadership, to be about co-creating impact from the inside out. We believe that burnout is the enemy of creating positive change. And we want to connect you with impact-driven leaders and ideas so that you can learn to thrive in today's impact-driven landscape. I'm here with Sarah Fanslau, our Chief of Impact, here today on the show. And as usual, of course, Sarah, good to be here with you today.
Great to be here.
And I think today we've been having some learnings. It seems like we've had multiple scenarios happen with organizations that we've been working with. We've had some learnings within ourselves, within Thrive and our own team. And it really felt like a good time to bring up those learnings and what we've been noticing, particularly around organizational and relational progress. And how do we move from the subjective into the objective? Where do we move from expectations into more of agreements? How do we move from the undefined or the implicit into the defined and explicit? Yes. And so there's like so many, it's fascinating how many scenarios, as we were thinking about what we want to share about today, we're like, oh my gosh, we have a lot of rich learning right now that's been happening in real time within our context. So I thought we'd share a little bit about how to move from the subjective into the objective to, frankly, have progress, kind of like what we said, right? How do we move things forward? How do we not get angry and hurt with each other? What have we been learning in that journey?
Yeah, I'm excited about this topic because, as you said, we were chatting earlier today, and it just started to emerge because it's coming up so much. And so I think, when something is organically rising to the top like that, it's an important thing to talk about. And so, yeah, we have some good stories, and I'm excited to dive in.
Yeah. Well, let's define this a little bit. I mean, I started to do that a little bit around the this versus that, subjective versus objective. But let's get into the pains right off the bat. Like, what is going on? What are the issues around subjectivity versus objectivity, and where subjectivity many times gets in our way of what we want? I'm curious, Sarah, what you're noticing.
Yeah, certainly. Well, we're working with a number of organizations as usual, but one in general where we're really focusing on, the board. And we've been working with them for a number of months, right? And it was really about helping the various committees kind of get going and connect the dots and making sure they had, standard operating procedures for things like emails and, rhythms of learning. But the more I got into it, and really today I was in a conversation with folks, and what I realized, it was kind of like an aha, the problem really was that there was a lack of measurable goals at the organization and at the board level. And so what happened, the pain that was happening as a result of that, was that everything felt personal. And so, for example, right, the executive director on one hand was saying, I don't know what the board wants to know, and the board was saying, I don't know what I don't know, right? And so there was this chasm of not knowing. Whereas if there had been, a set of shared goals, that's what you share about, right? You share progress in relation to goals. But even beyond that, the board chair was saying, I really want to ask a question about strategic planning. And I feel a little uncomfortable, like stepping on toes, right? She had a pain of not wanting to make some relational damage. But again, if strategic planning, which actually is one of their goals, had been, outlined as one of their goals, it would have been a natural part of the conversation. And so I was just struck by the fact that when we are not explicit with each other about the things and co-create the things we want to do together, then everything feels like, oh, this is my thing and I care about it, so I'm going to bring it up. Instead of, this is a thing we've decided together is important, so let's continue to work on it.
And it's like these implicit expectations that I now have or don't even realize I have. And then on the board side and then the executive director side, having whatever those are too, but those many times are mismatched in the first place. We didn't really talk about them, but now we're getting angry at the other person, and we're just wrapped up in this personal subjective space of not saying, what is it that we want?
Right.
What is it? And ultimately, what does that translate into around our goals and how we actually want to share and talk about them?
Yes. Yeah. And then how can we, I think the other pain that we've seen so many times is that without a clear, measurable goal that you can actually measure progress toward, it is so easy for folks to feel they become disengaged, right? Because there's not a North Star. Without a North Star that we're working toward, it can become really easy to just see the tasks, right? And the activities we need to do without reminding ourselves of why it's important and the change that it's ultimately going to lead to. And so I think that's the other big pain is that, especially you think about board members, these are all volunteers, right? For the most part. And it's so important for those volunteers to be constantly connected back to how the work they're doing is directly impacting the mission of the organization they're supporting, because that's why they came to sit on the board, because they love that mission. And goals connected to that mission, drive energy, right? Create passion, create excitement.
I was also thinking of another way. I remember when I was the head of fundraising at an organization, I remember getting so frustrated with my conversations with my boss. And after a little while, I had grown in my my learning. Like, if I'm getting frustrated, then let me not blame the other person. Let me just look at, okay, how do we have better conversations?
Yeah.
And it was then that I was realizing, and this took me a minute, I was getting pretty frustrated and ultimately blaming too. And then I was like, wait a second, like, I need to reflect on how I am showing up in this situation and realizing I'm just bringing what is ultimately perceived as my opinion.
Right.
And then he would bring his opinion. And now we're having opinion battles, which is a subjective conversation of almost like me versus him.
Yeah.
And I remember the day that I started to bring data, and I'm trying to remember exactly what the data was, but it was having, I remember sitting in his office, and I think we had some survey data from some form of fundraising campaign or something that we did. And instead of me just telling him what I thought about it, I said, hey, let's look at the data and let's look and see what it is that we see from that.
Yeah.
And like, just by putting something else out that we have now reflection and conversation about, that turned it into an objective. And I still had the things that I was talking about before were still the same things I wanted to talk about, but now I had objectivity and some data to be able to use it and to speak to it, to be able to shift how we were doing campaigns. And ultimately we were able to shift because I had brought this data versus prior to bringing this data around surveys and what people were sharing, it was my opinion versus his. And it's like, well, I guess that's what it is, and just perpetuated cycles of reactivity, frankly, between the two of us.
Yeah.
That we
so
didn't
did
enjoy.
That conversation and that data help you all? Like, did you create kind of a sense of shared understanding from the data that then helped you take a next step? Or what did that data?
Yeah, it really did. It helped us to figure out, again, these were next steps that I was wanting to do, but the way I was approaching it was a subjective approach versus an objective approach. And once we had the data that we were looking at, and we ultimately both came to the same conclusion, because the data was pretty clear on whatever that particular campaign was. But then I had his buy-in, and ultimately it was, he felt like he was a part of the process of coming up with the solution. Like, it was ultimately, I'm realizing now, I didn't know co-creation back then, but I realized that was like a form of co-creation. in a sense by bringing data into the equation and having an approach that way, as opposed to just getting more and more angry at like, why won't he listen to me? Why won't he do, I'm the head of fundraising. Like, why can't we?
Right.
And so it helped us to make decisions and aligned decisions that we had agreements around.
Right. Yeah, I love that part because it's twofold. It's the process of, you two doing it together and coming to agreement. And then it's clear and, measurable next steps. And those two things together, I think, is the key, right?
Yeah.
It's the process and the outcome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've got another scenario that's happened literally this last couple of weeks that I wanted to bring forward just in our own learning inside of Thrive. And part of the reason why I wanted to share these things too is that it is so important for us that we are not just coming across as experts, but like we are truly learners on this journey too. And that's hopefully you're experiencing this from this podcast, that, your team being able to see how you're learning, and like, hopefully we're giving you an example that sometimes is a little bit too close. Like it feels a lot of courage to share what we're learning. But I just wanted to share a particular story that's been happening lately that has been real active learning. Like last week was a frustrating week.
It was.
And there were a lot of conditions around that. I and Julie were just off of a huge workshop and big leadership development retreat, really, in Mexico. Sarah, you were sick, and your boys were sick, and and like we were. There was undercurrent of just tired, sick,
for sure,
exhausted, which is really important to notice and notate. But we had this conversation that. By most, frankly, as I've reflected on it too, by most ways of looking at it, we did our process, but we led with appreciation, which is important. And then we got into some process improvements around this particular topic that we were working on, particularly around our sales approach that we have with existing organizations that we're working with. But I was like hurt. I was angry, and it had been like festering for, I've noticed, particularly around this one topic, it had felt so close, and I was just like so frustrated and so hurt. And it wasn't just this conversation, it was this whole topic with this particular situation that had kept like grating on me and grating on me and grating on me. And I was like, whoa. I realized, one, I need to pause, notice, and choose, and really take some space to understand, I probably need some recovery time. That's a whole other topic, which we've talked about a lot, but that was an important piece. But then I realized one of the things that we're going through as a team is we've actually been going through a lot of transitions. So Julie on our team, who was deep in our programs, is now our chief relationship officer, and she is on our revenue side. And then we brought on somebody named Megan, who came on and we hired her to come on and replace Julie's role on the program side. And so I noticed that we're going through a lot of transitions in really big areas of our work around some of the key roles that people are playing. And it dawned on me that, why am I getting so hurt? Why am I getting so frustrated? Part of it is because I have some growth I need. And there was some things that were triggering me from olden days that I was like, I need some healing here, and just noticing that. But the other side was realizing we never really had an objective process for how we want to go through transition. We never really named it. We never really talked about, we know that it's happening, but and in transition, there's a lot of, it's an added capacity to go through transition.
It is.
Because you're learning a new system, almost not a whole new system, but you're learning new people, and those new people are learning new systems. And what you were leaning on before aren't quite exactly how you were leaning on it now. And I realized, as I was thinking about, I was actually talking to Aaron on our team, and also looking into experiential learning theories. And, and there's this whole sequence of process around people learning things, which is, one of them is I do, we do, you do. Like you watch me do, then we do together, and then you do, and you just
Right.
go.
Yeah.
And as I read that, I actually read it in a book and then talked to Aaron about it. I was like, oh my gosh, that would have been a helpful,
Yeah.
objective understanding of what we're going through. And, like over the next month, it's going to be some like give and take, and there's going to be a decent amount of we do in
Right.
this situation.
Yeah.
And are we open to, for us to be able to do that together, and just naming that objective process that we're going through,
Yes. Yeah.
um, versus just clunking along in it and then getting pissed off, which is what happened with.
Totally. Well, especially because, I mean, underlying this and everything else, of course, are relationship dynamics. And so in some ways it's really easy or easier when you bring a brand new person into the team because there's a blank slate, right? And I think there's expectation around learning and apprenticing almost, and then doing, I think that's a pretty common thing when you come in. But when you're moving roles, I think in particular, like that piece of moving to a role is partially where things get, you know I think there's questions about what does it look now if I've already been here and I already know this. And so I think, as we were talking the other day, I agree with you that, first of all, um, ideally, this objective reality exists before the start of a process, right? And
Yeah.
we were talking about that with onboarding, rather, whether new or existing members of teams into a role, that you need to have that structure beforehand so that when or if relationship dynamics come up, which is to say, hey, maybe I'm in a new role and I think I already know it. And you're like, well, sir, you probably don't know it quite yet. I need to step in and support you, right? Like we have a process that has that built in rather than it needing to be a case by case basis. Because I think it's the case by case basis where then it feels personal,
Mhm.
right? It feels personal. And I mean, this is the same thing that happened in the organization I was talking a minute ago about, right? Like it got down to where everything felt like a personal attack, right? Because there hadn't been any objectivity around the relationship at the start. And when that happens, then you almost need to hit pause. You need to do some relationship repair, right? And
Which we
then
did.
be able to say, right, then now we need to create some objectivity so that we
Mhm.
can go forward from objectivity, right? And not continue in the subjectivity.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And I'm even thinking about this with this situation. Like I was realizing, and we still need to take this step to your point in our transitions that we're going through as a team. What does the rest of this month look
Yeah.
like? Right.
Yeah.
What is at the end of this month? What can we, what agreements do we want to get in around the we do work pieces,
Yeah.
because we are still in transition,
Right.
and being able to name that's true. And somebody jumping in to help and support is not a undermining of your abilities, or is not uh, a micromanaging from me, which is something I'm very sensitive about, that came up last week. And I'm like, yeah, and noticing I have some trigger, which like even more so,
Yeah.
I'm like, I got to get to objectivity as fast as possible now.
Yeah.
um, and that sounds like a really healthy step for us, to let's talk about that. Let's put it out there and say, hey, we
Yeah.
know we're in transition, and over the next 3 weeks, right, we're almost to the middle of the month, about where we're at in March. What do we want?
Yeah.
What does it mean? And then maybe the month of April is like the full you do, moving forward, you're off and running.
Yeah. 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 I completely agree. And I think one thing you were just hitting on that, you and I kind of wrestle with is this, not this tension between the process and the person, right? And as you were just talking, I think, we think about those two pieces came up for me, right? So why don't you tell folks like what the process and the person thing is?
Oh, we just have a statement that we use, which is blame the process, not the person.
Yeah.
And I mean, nothing is 100%, but I think that, to your point, what we're talking about around, when we live in this subjective world, it starts to get personal, which means that we're starting to blame the person. And
Yeah.
the default to me is look at the process, which makes it objective, I think, is it's not
Mm.
a personal, we assume best intent. That's our ideal
Yeah.
around our empathy core value. Assume best intent, give the benefit of the doubt, and see where is it in the process that we can help to support improving. But you and I have tussled over this because
Yeah.
this is a like a, but when is the person the issue? How do you,
Exactly,
how,
because there
and
sometimes is. Yeah. Yeah. And
who,
we
but
have
who
to
makes
be
that
able to
call?
live, I think, into that both and, but it was coming up for me as you were talking because we do need to create an objective process and this board needs to create some objective goals. And there is still kind of personal responsibility and personal role within that, right? Like I think I said the example I used the other day, you think about McDonald's or whatever, they have a brilliant system, right, for churning out Happy Meals and everything else. But if the person supposed to be getting the fries together is not getting the fries together, it's not the process. It may be the person, but maybe that person needs more support, right? But after a time of giving that person support to operate the fry machine, like McDonald's is going to be like, hey, right? Like, here's the job, here are your responsibilities. We've given you the support to meet them, and you're still not. And so there's, for me, a both and this is where I think this, let's say next week we create an objective system along the, I do, we do, you do process.
Mhm.
And, there's a human in that mix saying, I can already do it. I can already do the you do, right? Like, or I do. Like, what are we going to do there, right? Like, because I know this is where, what if I already feel I'm ready to do it by myself?
Yeah.
And I think this is the challenge, on the
Yeah.
other side of it, like, not the underperforming side, but almost the overperforming side of saying, listen, like, I've got this. I don't need it. Like, that sounds like a great system, but not really necessary right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, and this is where it gets into so many nuances because, like the situation we're dealing with, or we were wrestling through last week, it was this pretty complex situation, and there's been some things where our revenue team has really been able to just fully run, like typically more simple situations or more just less complex.
Yeah.
That they can run with it, and they can run with it from the beginning of the process too. But this one has been this one that's really complex. It's an existing organization we've been working with for quite a while now. There's a lot of nuance that they're not going to have any idea about, that won't even show up until, we see something on a page, right? Or on an email,
Right.
like, oh wait, but that's missing this. But like, I wasn't going to think about that ahead of time. Like I was like,
Right.
I just know that there's a lot of context that we have built into you and I, Sarah, being deeply a part of the process. And so like it's hard to understand, which
Yeah.
situation that you say, no, this is I'm ready to run. But what if I don't think they're ready yet? Like, I don't know. I mean, this is part of this is this
Yeah.
tension and maybe that's where we give it a time frame,
Yeah.
and yeah, we give it a time frame. That's why I'm thinking by the end of this month, we want to have no more of the we do's. Like we hopefully will have been able to, really understand our process, particularly around existing organizations we're working with, into the next parts of our work with them. Because you and I are deep in these trenches. I mean, we are in super deep with a lot of these people. We've built these relationships.
Yeah.
We know a lot of the nuanced context of what's going on. It's really hard to communicate over to a revenue team in some real time way. And
Yeah.
that's a process that we're really wrestling through. That is a process question, not your capability or lack thereof
Yeah.
question. But how does that not become a capability conversation? And it
Yeah.
does become a process conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. It's tough. I mean, I think the point we made earlier that it needs to be set up from the beginning is the key part here. Because once things are underway, then it's very hard, I think, to back up the train and make them feel subjective. But if you can't do that, I do think the kind of the piece of pausing to realize, pause, notice, and choose, make some relationship repair, and then co-create that objectivity moving forward is. And then I really like your thought around the time frame, because instead of it feeling like you know, okay, maybe we co-create this so I feel okay about it, but like it's not forever, right? I think that's the other piece that can really help it feel more, psychologically safe,
Yeah.
as it
Well, and I'll freely admit, I mean, for me and what I'm learning as a CEO right now, is really trying to understand my own anxiety. And I was telling Aaron and Julie, I was like, a question that could be really helpful for me, because one of the things I don't want to do at Thrive Impact is to create conditions where I feel totally isolated.
Yeah.
I don't want it for anybody either, in general. Like, I don't want anybody to feel isolated and in loneliness. And I, so much of the time it becomes CEOs become, I mean, it's the lone wolf, that linchpin between a board and a staff, and it's just like this, by default, it is naturally a very isolating role. I'm just like, how do we create the space that not only do we not feel isolated, I also do not feel isolated in my job as a CEO. And that, because I was thinking about like, what would be a question that I could ask them to ask me. And the question that came up for me was, I said this to both Aaron and Julie. I said, if you both could ask me a question like, hey, I know as we're going through this transition, what are the things that we can do to help to support you stepping out of the work that you know you don't want to be doing, but you're in transition? What are the things that we can do to support you in your transition? Because I'm stepping out of the revenue side in a lot of ways, and just like letting go. It's who, not how. They're Julie and Aaron, the how on revenue. I am not. Thank the Lord. Like, I'm all good with that. And I'm also still transitioning, which is really meaning I'm learning along the way. So I was trying to think of like ways what are questions that people could ask me that I would feel heard and seen as an executive or as a CEO. That also helps us to figure out how to process things, that we're honoring one another's process too.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's almost, instead of, or I'm going to bring us back to Darcy and the decision maker, accountable, responsible, consulted, and informed. Instead of seeing you as the D, the decider, right? You get to be a C, and in some places an R. And so it's, I think it's partially about, and I agree with you on the CEO being isolated, but it's almost like, not seeing the CEO as a CEO, but as a team member, right? And then how does that shift in perspective allow us space to, instead of feeling like I'm performing up to, right, I'm learning with. And I think that is part of our challenge, honestly, in some ways, you know, because of existing power dynamics, right? They're really hard to get away from.
Yeah, because we've been, this is the quote I talked about, earlier today in our co-creation workshop around Peter Senge saying, our prevailing system of management has been destroying our people because it's about control and not about learning.
Yeah.
And you were just literally hitting on that. Like, I'm not a CEO that you're performing for. Like, we are performing for a mission and to create positive change in a sustainable way, but we're really doing it by learning and learning together. When you just said that, I was like, that's exactly what I want. It's is continue to get more objectivity of what my role as a CEO is and what it is not. In all of these situations and in all these nuances. Otherwise, it does feel like it's creating these power dynamics that we all grew up from. We all, as Peter Senge said, this prevailing system of management started when we were all age 5 and went into kindergarten, and here it comes. Like, we all knew about learning before we went to school. So then what happened? Then we stopped being about learning. It was much more about performance for somebody else's approval. And that we've all been swimming in these waters for so many years that it's a lot of unlearning to do.
Yeah. For everyone, it's a lot of unlearning to do,
Well, so Sarah, I'm curious just to hit, let's say we are able to move from subjective to objective. let's say we are able to go from expectations, typically unsaid, implicit, to explicit agreements that were co-created agreements, from the undefined to the defined, from the unclear to the clear. Like, what's really made possible, and what have you even seen within our organization when we've done this, and other organizations that we've worked with to help do this? What's made possible for these leaders when we go from subjective to objective?
Yeah, I mean, I think back to an organization that we helped recently to refresh their strategic plan and really create much more measurable targets. And when we started, there was just it was just some rancor between the board and the staff, and really just frustration because each side could not see what the other wasn't seeing. And because they couldn't see it, they didn't know how to move through it together. And, once we were able to help them co create measurable targets and work toward them and report on them, I think there was a huge sense of relief, right?
Mm,
That folks felt finally understood. They felt like they were talking a common language. And I think really importantly, they felt unstuck, right? I think for quite a while, that organization had and that the CEO in particular had felt stuck in not knowing how to move through that problem.
yeah.
And once they were able to create that clarity and alignment, I think the wheel of feeling unstuck really started to roll for her and the team.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, we did a co-creation 101 workshop earlier today, and really noticing the direct correlation between co-creative leadership and reducing burnout. Like, co-creative leadership, and I feel like I want to show up for work. Co-creative leadership and better ideas emerge. Frankly, a better alignment happens.
Big
We've
time.
been gathering so much of that information on alignment and understanding what are we really trying to do here. And I love that Jim Collins quote of, going from good to great is not, it's 1% vision and 99% alignment. And that so
Yeah.
much of the work is not defining the vision, although that's an important part. But now it's the alignment work. And that's the like real deep
Yeah.
work of noticing where we're out of alignment. It feels like somebody's disconnected from others. Um, and how do we come back into a space of alignment, which alignment ultimately is objectivity. We all know where we're all going together and the roles that we're
Yes.
playing towards that, right? That is an
Exactly.
objective understanding of what we're
Yeah.
all doing together.
Yeah. Well, and I think it also, it helps energize people to get moving. Again, I had this conversation earlier today about this board work and had put together some project plans that, and I said to these folks, I said, is this too heavy of a tool in the context of a board to use? And the board chair said, you know what? Like, as I said before, she said, I don't have a capacity problem helping the committees to move forward. But if I don't have a tool and an understanding of what they're doing, I can't check in with them because I don't know what I'm checking in with them on. Right. And
Mm,
so all of a sudden it was like this, the measurable goal plus the tool. Then she was like, now I can really go and help drive the committees towards their goal. And she couldn't do that before because she didn't have the understanding of where they were going, and she didn't have the information she needed in order to help drive the progress forward. So I also just think, and I was struck again today how why people need those things in order to do their work. Right. And so often when they don't have those things, they sit feeling disempowered or disengaged. And when they have them, they're like, right, let's get going now.
yeah. Yeah. That reminds me too of why it's important when we're doing workshops, when we're having our own meetings, why it's important to get to a place of out of verbal processing
Yeah.
and into something we're looking at. Like
Correct.
whether it's me
100%.
pulling up my iPad and showing things that we're talking about, and we're all looking, like there's something about like literally we're all looking at the same thing. Whereas if I'm
Yes.
just saying something, somebody heard something and somebody else heard something totally different, even though I said the same thing. But there's
100%.
something different, kind of like that example I shared at the beginning of when instead of having a verbal conversation with my CEO, I
Right.
pulled up some data and I invited us to look at it together. And just by doing that, it created a more objective situation.
Yeah.
Or when we gather voices in a written way, and we use Easy Retro, which is a phenomenal tool to gather voices in a written way and in a fast way with lots of voices in an anonymous way. But now everybody can see each other's voices, and it's like, those are the words that they wrote, right? It wasn't through my own filters. It's just like, there's something about, we're all looking at something together that really shapes our conversations. You know, I mean, you've probably experienced this a lot. Like whenever I pull up my iPad and I start drawing, how does that change how we're engaging in what we're talking about? Like, you know, that.
Yes. Well, especially now that I know what it feels like to have it, you know, now when we don't have it, I'm like, Tucker, can you pull up your iPad? Right? Because we need it. And I can see people when you're just having a verbal conversation, you can see minds going whoop and whoop, right? Like I can literally see that. We had a conversation today where I was like, I can see her mind going somewhere else. Like, let's get that so we can also focus attention, right? Focus attention for the folks who are not going to be held with the verbal words. So yeah, I mean, I think what we're getting to is that there's some big things here around kind of measurable targets that are co-created. And then there's some process pieces of, you know, gathering voices using and I never can say that word. Anonymity.
Anonymity. Anonymous.
Anonymity.
Anonymity. Yeah, it's a tough word. It's awkward.
Using anonymity, but then also leveraging tools, right, for different styles of learning and seeing the iPad, the project plan, getting it down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, so let's end with this because we're hitting on some practical steps. You know, if you're an impact driven leader and you're many times you're in this world of subjective because we're in this work probably it's what I kicked off with, right? You're not in this world to just do nice things. You're not here to just create a profit. You're here to create positive change and make it sustainable, which also means that you're close to some of the challenges that people are facing, which means your heart may be a little bit more involved than if it was just a transactional business. And so I think Sarah, what are some practical steps that any impact driven leader can start to do to, you know, small and large and anywhere in between that we can start to do to bring more objectivity into our work?
Yeah, I would say the first thing is to identify those places where your team is constantly coming into conflict. What are those spaces that are rising to the top again and again as areas of challenge? Maybe it's the same meeting every month that always ends in a fight. Maybe it's the same department that's constantly at each other. I don't know, but like start to think about those patterns of relationship challenge that you may be seeing repeat themselves over and over again.
Oh, that's good.
And, you know, I would say dig in to identify where subjectivity versus objectivity is driving some of that challenge. Maybe it's a lack of clear goals. Maybe it's a lack of process. Maybe folks just don't have the tools they need to work together effectively. But that's what I think I would say. Identify the relationship challenge and then figure out within that how subjectivity is driving some of those. And then co-create with the team the objectivity that can shift conversations from being about me and you and our problems to the things we want to do together.
Yeah.
What about you?
Well, I think everybody needs to get a document camera and get something to write on, to your point. And you just got one too, Sarah, which is great. I'm so excited to see. I can't wait for like, here comes Sarah with her, like she's going to write on her iPad. That'd be so good. I'm all joking aside. I actually think it's a really important thing, whether you're in an in-person meeting or you're in a virtual, you know, a Zoom meeting. A faster way to help people to make it a more objective place and also to help people learn is by having something that they're looking at and we're looking at together. I love document cameras. You can get them on Amazon. There's like a ton of them. I have an IPEVO. And then I actually just draw on my iPad. But that discipline has been really helpful for me to learn to sink things into myself, to be more present for meetings themselves. but it also has created some more, and it's not perfect, right? But it's created more objectivity that we're all co-creating around something.
Yeah.
And in some ways, it's almost like we have work product to show for it now after we're done.
Okay. Yeah.
That also feels good as well. So, I mean, that really is a practical step that I think every leader can have with, bringing some objectivity into the room. And the other thing is, I mean, we speak to data a lot. And Sarah, I was going to ask this earlier and I forgot, but it was really like your role in Thrive Impact is. I remember one of your long time ago social media posts about being a data queen. And
Yeah.
do you remember that with your shirt on?
Yeah.
Like, I'm a data queen. I love that post.
Oh, yeah.
It's one of my favorite posts. But keep finding ways to bring data into your work to help you to make decisions, and invite people, like I was sharing with my boss back in the day, invite people to make meaning of your data together. Yeah. What are we noticing that is in the data around our conversion rates on our website, or that is around our ability to, create more well-being, positive well-being in our staff, or whatever it is that your data is. This is one practice that we do a lot of is we try to bring in as much data as we can. We're including the very voices of the people who answered questions from the last meeting we had around what is it that we want to celebrate. Well, then the next meeting is many times, how might we get there? Well, we bring back the data for people to look back at and reflect on, and to continue to make meaning around it, and make meaning around it together. And I think that's a really important practical step that people can take to make things more objective.
Totally agree.
Anything else that's there for you? This is a really rich topic.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I was just going to say, to the data point you made, it's a good one. And in, the research and evaluation space, we call that sense making. And it's to say that any data set, right, can be seen in multiple ways. And now, instead of, some researcher coming in and telling folks what things say, instead we're asking people what the data says to them. And I think it's such a vital step. And to your point, it's not just quantitative data, it's also voices. Voices are qualitative data, and that counts too. And so I love your point about bringing in data, because I think it's so vital. So bring it in, but don't use it as a weapon, because that's what people often use data
because the state is this, therefore here's what I think. You're wrong.
Exactly. And instead,
data with a question.
Yeah, data with a question. What do you see? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What are you noticing here? Yeah, that's great. Awesome. Well, Sarah, as usual, wonderful podcast to just chat through. I love having these what we're learning podcasts.
Yeah,
it's helpful for us too, and it's part of our. I've really noticed this. This is one of our own rhythms of learning. We talk about learning organizations a lot, and I've noticed this. Having this tool of a podcast is like our own rhythm of learning. Of like, oh yeah, what have we been noticing? And it gives us the pause to be able to say, what have we been learning? Because God, we're learning so much, and the speed of change is happening so fast that we don't pause and just like notice for a little bit. So I'm grateful to have this space to just notice, like, what have we been learning? What have we been seeing with ourselves and others? So thanks for doing the podcast with me. It's fun.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, everybody, thanks for listening in. I don't know if we have anything for the show notes today outside of just a bunch of stories, but if we do come up with something, a link to the IP, get a document camera. Yeah, exactly. We'll put that in the show notes. A link to getting an IPvo, a document camera you can use for virtual meetings. But other than that, if we have anything else, we'll pop it up there. But otherwise, we'll see you on the next episode. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, y'all.